Imagine a world where the most loyal defenders of a movement suddenly become its loudest critics. Picture a scenario where the very people who built a political fortress start tearing it down from the inside. This isn't just a story about a few angry social media posts. This is a deep look at a potential future where the American executive branch finds itself at war, not just with foreign powers, but with its own foundation. For years, the political movement known as MAGA was a solid wall. It was built on a simple promise: put the country first, stop the forever wars, and bring a hard-headed, business-like approach to the world stage. But what happens if that wall starts to crack? What happens when the influencers and media figures who gave a president his power start calling for his removal? The 25th Amendment was once a tool discussed only in backrooms by political rivals. In this looming crisis, it's being shouted from the rooftops by the very people who were once the inner circle. We have to ask, what leads to this kind of total breakdown? To understand this what-if scenario, we have to look at the pressure points of modern statecraft. Power is not just about having the biggest military. It's about the consistency of your word. If a leader's word becomes a moving target, the entire structure of the government begins to shake. The answer lies in a massive shift in how the U.S. handles global power. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been the world's most important oil artery. The U.S. Navy has spent billions of dollars and decades of time making sure that water remains free for everyone, but a new projection is emerging. Imagine a reality where the U.S. stops being the world's police and starts acting like a landlord. The idea has been floated: a joint venture between the U.S. and Iran to charge tolls on every ship passing through the strait. Think about that for a second. In this projection, every oil tanker, every cargo ship, and every piece of global trade would have to pay a fee to a partnership between two of the world's biggest rivals. It sounds like a business deal, but in the world of statecraft, it looks like a surrender of global leadership. When word of this kind of policy shift hits the public, the reaction isn't just disagreement, it's a total revolt. The people who voted for a strong, independent America see this as a betrayal. They see it as handing over the keys to the world's energy supply to a hostile power. And that's when the calls for removal start. Figures like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and Alex Jones have built their platforms on the idea of a predictable, strong leadership. When that leadership starts making moves that feel erratic or contradictory, the movement doesn't just bend, it breaks. We are seeing a projection of a world where a leader says one thing in the morning, suggesting a beautiful business deal with a rival, and then threatens total destruction by the afternoon. This kind of flip-flopping isn't just bad politics. In a what-if scenario involving nuclear-armed states and global energy markets, it's a recipe for a global heart attack. If the world doesn't know what the U.S. is going to do next, the world stops trusting the U.S. entirely. The fear among the base isn't just about a bad deal, it's about a loss of grip. They start to use words like madness. They look at the shifting stories: staying in NATO one day, leaving the next, fighting a war with Iran 1 hour, begging for a ceasefire through a third party the next, and they see a machine that has lost its steering wheel. If this scenario plays out, we aren't just looking at a few bad news cycles. We are looking at a fundamental crisis of the state. If the vice president and the cabinet are forced to look at the 25th Amendment because the leader's own base is demanding it, the U.S. enters a period of instability that hasn't been seen in over a century. Why does this matter to you? Because global markets hate a vacuum. If the U.S. executive branch is busy fighting its own supporters, it isn't watching the moves being made by China or Russia. If the U.S. is floating ideas about charging tolls for the ocean, other countries will start to claim their own pieces of the global commons. The South China Sea, the Arctic, the Mediterranean. If the rules of the road are up for sale, everyone will try to buy a piece. This is the ultimate threat analysis. It's not about one man, it's about the office. When the person holding the most powerful job in the world loses the trust of the very people who put him there, the entire structure of the government begins to shake. The base starts to look for someone else to hold the line. They start talking about adults in the room. They start looking at the vice president as the only stable hand. This creates a shadow government effect where no one knows who is actually in charge. Does the general in the field listen to the president's tweet or the vice president's quiet reassurance? That is how wars start by accident. We have to look at the Hormuz deal as a test case. If a leader is willing to turn a global public good, like the freedom of the seas, into a private toll booth, what else is on the table? Is the security of allies for sale? Is the stability of the dollar for sale? These are the questions that drive the removal movement. It's a fear that the state has been replaced by a deal, and the deal isn't a good one for the people. As we analyze this looming threat, we see a pattern of behavior that the base calls manic. It's the constant need for attention and the public attacks on anyone who asks a hard question. For a movement built on strength, this looks like the ultimate weakness. The statecraft here is failing. Real power is quiet. Real power is consistent. But in this fractured reality, power has become loud, messy, and desperate. The what if here is scary. What if the system can't handle a leader who has lost his own team? The 25th Amendment is a high bar. It requires a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. It is designed to be almost impossible to use. But the fact that it is even being discussed by the most loyal media voices in the country tells us that the crisis has already arrived. In this projection, we see a commander-in-chief who is isolated. He is sitting in the White House, lashing out at his former friends, while the world watches with bated breath. He's offering ceasefires to Iran in secret while promising fire and brimstone in public. He's trying to please everyone and ending up with no one. The end result of this kind of internal collapse is a weakened nation. It doesn't matter how many bombs you have or how big your economy is if your own people are calling for your removal. The power of the United States comes from its predictability and its unity. Without those, it's just a giant with a broken compass. As we move forward into this uncertain future, the lesson for power and statecraft is clear. Leadership isn't just about winning an election. It's about keeping the trust of the people who gave you the power in the first place. Once that trust is gone, once the base starts using words like lunatic and madness, the clock starts ticking. The scenario we've discussed today is a warning. It's a look at how fast the world can change when the center doesn't hold. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes a toll road and the 25th Amendment becomes a campaign slogan, the world we knew is over. But let's go deeper into the mechanics of this collapse. In a 2,000-word analysis, we have to look at the secondary and tertiary effects. When the base demands the removal of a leader, it creates a vacuum of authority. In this what-if scenario, we look at the Pentagon. Military leaders are trained to follow the chain of command. But what happens to that chain when the commander-in-chief is publicly being called unfit by his own former advisors? The military begins to look inward. They start to question every order. If an order comes down to strike a target, is it a strategic move or a political distraction? This uncertainty is how a superpower begins to rot from the inside. Now consider the economic fallout. If the U.S. is charging tolls in the Middle East, the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is put on the chopping block. Why would a country like Japan or Germany keep their wealth in dollars if those dollars are being used to fund a joint venture with a sanctioned regime? The shift away from the dollar would happen faster than anyone expects. We're talking about a global economic reset where the U.S. loses its ability to print money and export its inflation. This is the real cost of a fractured executive branch. It's not just about politics. It's about the bread on your table and the gas in your car. The Hormuz toll idea is a perfect example of short-term thinking versus long-term statecraft. A leader might see a few $billion in revenue from charging ships. But the world sees a breakdown of the post-W12 order. Since 1945, the U.S. has guaranteed that the oceans belong to everyone. If the U.S. abandons that principle for a quick buck, the principle dies forever. Other countries will start to enclose their own waters. You'll see toll roads in the English Channel, the Panama Canal, and the Malacca Strait. Global trade would become a patchwork of fees and shakedowns, driving up the price of everything you buy. This is the looming threat that the removal movement is actually worried about, even if they don't use those exact words. When Candace Owens or Alex Jones talks about madness, they are reacting to the loss of a shared reality. In a healthy state, everyone agrees on the basic facts, even if they disagree on the solutions. But in this scenario, the facts change every hour. One day, Iran is the enemy of the world. The next day, they are a business partner. One day, NATO is a vital alliance. The next day, it's a scam. This manic policymaking makes it impossible for allies to plan and impossible for enemies to be deterred. If an enemy doesn't know where your red line is, they will keep pushing until they accidentally cross it. That is how a what-if scenario turns into a global war. The internal revolt is also a media war. In this projection, the state-run media and the independent base media are at each other's throats. You have Jesse Waters on one side telling people to cope with the leader they have, while Laura Loomer is on the other side talking about animalistic enemies and destruction. This isn't a conversation. It's a shouting match in a burning building. The middle ground has completely vanished. When a nation's media can't agree on whether the president is sane, the nation has already lost its way. The what-if of the 25th Amendment also brings up the question of succession. If the leader is removed or if he is simply sidelined while his base fights over his legacy, who actually runs the country? We see a scenario where the vice president becomes a president in all but name. But this creates its own problems. A leader without a clear mandate is a weak leader. They can't make big moves. They can't sign big treaties. They are just a placeholder. For a country like the US, being a placeholder for 4 years is a death sentence for its global standing. China doesn't take placeholders. Russia doesn't take placeholders. They take territory. We also have to analyze the ceasefire begging reports. In this scenario, a leader who publicly promises to obliterate a civilization is privately sending messages through third parties like Pakistan, begging for a way out. This is the ultimate statecraft failure. It shows that the tough talk is just a mask for a lack of a real plan. It's the behavior of someone who is in over their head. The base sees this, and they feel the humiliation. They see their country, which is supposed to be the strongest on earth, running to other nations to help them talk to a regime they just threatened to destroy. It makes the US look like a paper tiger. The what if here ends with a choice. The system either corrects itself, or it breaks. If the 25th Amendment is used, it's a shock to the system that might take decades to heal. If it's not used, and the leader continues to drift, the system might just slowly grind to a halt. The gears of government will stop turning because no one trusts the person at the top to make the right call. The removal demand from the base is a cry for help. It's a group of people saying, we can't live like this anymore. As we wrap up this deep dive, we have to look at the long-term projection. Even if this specific leader leaves the stage, the damage to the office is done. The idea that the US is a stable, predictable partner has been shattered. Future leaders will have to spend decades trying to prove that the US isn't just one election away from a manic phase. This is the real statecraft challenge of our time. It's not about winning a war, it's about rebuilding a reputation. Stay tuned as we continue to track these shifts in global power. Because in the world of statecraft, the most dangerous enemy is often the one you see in the mirror. Keep your eyes on the data, watch the shifts in the base, and never take the stability of the system for granted. The what if is closer than you think. This is Power in Statecraft, signing off. Keep watching, keep analyzing, and stay sharp. The world is changing faster than the headlines can keep up with.